Hey everybody, it's Dr. Long at Colorado Tech. This is the live chat for March 29th, 2019. I know we're on break. I just like to keep my own momentum going on Friday nights, so I thought I'd go ahead and record one for you. Appreciate you guys making the time. So we'll go through the standard agenda, and pending any questions from you guys or comments about the course so far, I'll just go ahead and get right into the live chat topics. You guys are doing a superb job across the board on all the requirements. The chapter or the IP number 3s look excellent so far. A couple of you have already turned those in ahead of time and looking good. You guys are making great progress through the material. The points I wanted to emphasize off of this list of working issues was just doing a great job on the synthesis level of integrating material in a way that a CEO or a client could really apply. So keep up the great work on all that. No issues on any of the other typical issues that I see in this course. So keep doing what you're doing. You are definitely developing what I've been calling that doctoral mind that has all of those specific qualities. So keep up the great work. You know, it's that discussion of the doctoral mind that we've had is something that's become a topic in our military college here, the professional college, which is, we teach kind of at the master's level. And it's related to the development of the field grade officer and their understanding of who they are and what they do for the Army as organizational leaders. And in the same way that you guys are working on developing the doctoral mind and the doctoral role, it's just a transition from maybe previous educational experiences where you were kind of learning from doctors about the state of the art in your discipline, kind of receiving the wisdom from those guys and then looking to master that material and then be certified on it by passing a test. In the same way that junior Army officers really have the task of learning the doctrine, taking on the culture of the organization, learning from their seniors about how to do things right. And then they get tested on how to do that in exercises and have they incorporated the culture and the doctrine into their standard practice. Not really expected to invent new things. Well, when they become organizational leaders as field grades, that's where we start expecting them to go beyond the existing material to incorporate creative thinking, innovation, critical thinking, and come up with new ways of maintaining competitive advantage and getting that trained faster than the opponent. So in many ways, when they make that transition from company grade tactical officer to organizational leader and field grade officer, that's requiring them to adopt new habits of thinking and performance and envision a new role for them, for themselves in the organization. And that's the big transition that they have to make at this time of their career. After 10 to 12 years of success in the old ways, they have to realize that what got them here won't get them there. They have to adopt new frames of reference, new ways of being, and learn how to meet the requirements of the new expectations. So in many ways, that's what you're doing in this course and this program, and taking on the role of the doctoral mind and the terminal degree holder, in which you're living on the boundary of what it is that we know and counting on doctors to be able to push the boundaries of knowledge into new areas and to evaluate new ideas, come up with new ways to create knowledge and to expand our knowledge. And that's always a venture. It's never certain. It's never clear exactly how that's going to go. It's not according to a, you know, an existing recipe. You're in the business of creating new recipes based on education and experience. And so continue to do that in your work in this course and beyond. You're off to a great start and doing good at all that. So um, that whole topic then of the doctoral mind and the field grade mind is something I've been having with my students here, as we enter April, the last couple months of their year-long curriculum before they graduate and then head back out into the world as new field grade officers and take on new challenges and responsibilities. So very exciting times for them, exciting times for you guys as you continue to make progress through the course and through the program. So keep up the great work. So what I wanted to talk about tonight is the theme of visualization for strategy making. And I'm going to try to pull together a bunch of different pieces and lead towards finally 3 case studies that come from my own professional practice that show how visualization is conducted in the world and is part of good strategy making, and how it can be liberating and creative and can actually act to support sharing a common vision or a common idea or common understanding. And I think it gets back to the fact that we evolved as hunters that relied on our visual cortex, our binocular vision, to be able to identify prey and then have the precision to make the kill shot with whatever tool or weapon that we were using. If you look at herd animals, like rabbits, deer, they have eyes on the side of their head that gives them the very wide fields of vision, and their eyes are geared towards picking up any sudden movement or a change in the background. So they have very wide vision, and then they just run away from that. So they don't need any more precision than that. What they need is just a wide, shallow field of vision. When you start looking at hunters and carnivores, they evolved eyes that move to the front of the head and gives the ability to use binocular vision in order to pinpoint their target in time and space. That comes at the cost of losing vision all around. So the binocular vision's price is that you have blind spots in certain areas. Well, the idea of the carnivore always moving, always hunting, or hunting in tribes or packs, you have your partners taking care of your blind spot, or by staying in motion, you don't have to worry about those blind spots. So the visual cortex evolved along with our expanding brain, and the expanded brain gave us the ability to process that information in space and time. And so visual imagery is very powerful when it comes to developing our understanding of our world. At the same time, this expanded brain in our facility for language gave us a verbal proficiency. And over millions of years, the storytelling and narration became crucial in preserving knowledge and passing on the lessons learned that were so hard won from the tribe. And then that was supported by things like, cave paintings and interpretive dance, and part of visual storytelling. So you get that combination of words and graphics to really lock in our codified human knowledge before writing comes along. Well, a guy who's very interesting to read on this, a world-class thinker, Dr. Steven Pinker, talks about in his work on neurocognitive biology, for example, the development, the evolution of our cognitive capacity and how it evolved to take advantage of the language and the visual cortex and shapes what it is to be human and how we're born with a brain that already seems to have been pre-wired with grammar and visual cues. Well, an extension of that then has been the research method of narrative inquiry. Now, one of our Colorado Tech adjunct professors emeritus, Dr. David Boje, B-O-J-E, is one of the world's leading authorities on all that and talks about the power of storytelling to create truth, to create our reality through the stories we tell, and how the act of analyzing those stories for their themes and then rearranging them or alternating them or changing some of those variables through restorying allows us to create alternative realities to consider and helps us understand how different people can see one situation and make their own stories and come to a very different set of realities. And he shows the connection between the way we make stories and the way we use words and the way we tell stories, the way we act them out, is part of our sense-making apparatus, and how that's really where the constructed universe comes from, is that rich connection to our storytelling and our narrative quality. So narrative inquiry becomes an interesting qualitative method for discovering the sense that people make of their surroundings and how in an organizational setting those competing narratives take on almost a political quality or a social quality that allows us to create a common understanding of what's going on in order to get organized and to achieve collaboration as more than individuals, but as teams. So narrative inquiry now becomes really powerful, and then some of the visual elements of storytelling goes along with that to support that power of narrative. And so the archetypical icons or artifacts that we create as part of our need or our drive to tell stories to make sense, these artifacts take on great significance, whether they're totem animals or relics or cultural icons of whatever type. So that becomes an understanding that whole visual and iconic objective qualities of our life becomes important in narrative inquiry. Well, I'll extend that to some work that's been done like in systems dynamics and the use of systems models. So when systems thinking and systems theory came along in the 20s, 30s, and 40s to help make sense of the increasingly complex nature of the world and our society, people began to study those systems and formulate theories. And some took the biological model, some took the computational model or the mechanistic model. But in every one of those cases, the systems model that was chosen and the theory that was used to explain it and to make sense out of all of it, Sengi's part of that whole tradition too. Out of that work comes some theories about systems dynamics from MIT, where they were looking at trying to model the dynamic nature of systems, which seems to be, a major part of every systems thinking theory. And as people would build these complex models and then share those models, the models themselves not only were useful in terms of trying to make predictions about the world, but they discovered that maybe the most powerful aspect of those models was the fact that they became very useful in describing what people thought was true about the world, that you could get a group of people together around a process or an organization or situation, and as they would describe their view of what was going on, a system model could be built and the dynamics of it could be explored. And the act of establishing this group communication icon, this artifact that the group would create, was among the most important elements or outputs of that systems inquiry. Now, those models could be useful and predictive and could be maybe sometimes simulated for training or education, or could be used as an operational tool. But really, the most persistent benefit from the practice of systems dynamics and systems modeling was it as a communication device that allowed groups of people to actually become teams and to collaborate together. Well, when we extend that idea into what the U.S. Army or Department of Defense and even innovative companies like IDEO have come to call design thinking, it turns out that that is an accelerated, systematic process of linking creative and critical thinking together in order to come up with innovative new ways to solve new kinds of problems. And there's almost always a standardized output of whatever school of design thinking you happen to be applying that features a combination of words in a statement that describe what's going on for those that are narrative or audio oriented, or that use word webs to understand the world, or and to incorporate sketches for the visually inclined. So you typically see, like in Army design thinking, when we're trying to develop an understanding of a new situation in order to explore it and then exploit it, we use design thinking to get it organized and to get our initial plans moving, and that includes an output of a concept statement and sketch, where we use words and imagery. Well, closely related to that is a critical thinking technique called argument mapping, in which a verbal argument gets rendered into a mind map, which shows the relationships between arguments and claims and evidence and warrants and rebuttals. And the act of visualizing the structure of that argument allows us to unpack complex stories and allows us to see the relationships between, actors and the story and the themes and the environment. And so there's a very strong visual quality in argument mapping, which becomes very effective in understanding the nuances of a word-based narrative. So that's proven to be one of the most powerful forms of teaching critical thinking, and improving operations is by doing that kind of visual argument mapping. To explore that even further, to use visualization for creative problem finding and problem solving, you could explore the world of mind mapping. I think his first name is Tony, but Buzan has written some good things about introductions to mind maps and the use of visual arrays and visual displays, not only as communication devices, but as ways to explore a problem space in order to quickly develop some possible solutions. So I pull all those things together to say that in our practice as strategic planners, that learning to develop proficiency in visualization for communication and for planning and problem solving is a really important skill that we can explore. And I would encourage you to try that maybe in some of these IPs or DBs and replace some words with maybe concept sketches or mind maps as an alternative. Yeah, Pareto charts are certainly another way to do that too. Think about the fishbone diagrams from Ishikawa in the that comes from the statistical process control, or cause and effect diagrams or control charts from Deming that give us visual display of what's going on in the system to determine if it's under control or not. So I want to talk about 3 different case studies that come from my own professional practice where there is a very strong element of both visual and narrative qualities. I'm going to show you how, as an OD consultant and an OD practitioner and a strategic planner, I use these kinds of tools as part of the toolkit for developing and then communicating good strategies. So the first one comes from an effort to reorganize the information management of a teaching department at my college. We have one of our departments called Delro, the Directorate for, or Department, yes, Directorate of Logistics and Resource Operations. So they're one of 5 different directorates that teach all of our military curriculum. And one of the things that we ended up doing was to try to describe what their mission was in the organization. And so we created this kind of visual mind map to start articulating the dimensions of their knowledge base. And we said that not only was the knowledge base what was inside of our heads and in our faculty, but also in this networked uh, construct of all the different locations where knowledge could be found, like our the Army's proponent for sustainment is called CASCOM, or the Combined Arms Support Command, and they're the schoolhouse that's responsible for managing and teaching transportation, maintenance, supply, food service, things like that. So as a teaching department in our college, it was important for us to have a good, strong connection to the Army's proponent for generating that kind of doctrine. And we had to talk with Department of Army and Joint Headquarters that were using logistics and resource operations so that we could understand not only the doctrine coming from CASCOM, but also the needs and insights from field practitioners that were applying that doctrine. And we had to be connected to other Combined Arms Center schools and activities that were teaching some of the other warfighting functions, because it's not just logistics, but it's also maneuver and fires and intelligence and signal, and all of those schools needed to have a relationship with our ability to sustain them through logistics. And so we had to have them as part of the total knowledge base. And the other teaching departments in our school at CGSC, like tactics and strategy and leadership and history and distance learning, all had knowledge that we needed to leverage, and we needed to be part of their knowledge base. So they became part of our overall knowledge base. The Department of the Army, the Battle Command Knowledge System, which was a compendium of lessons learned from field units that provide training in exercises, and then learning from their insights the challenges that groups were having. We would make that set of lessons learned part of our total knowledge base. And different working groups that were doing research or working on certain issues, publications that codified doctrine, and maybe other partners in the community out there. This total collection of linkages to other stakeholders and other partners, we came to realize that that was really the knowledge base. And it wasn't just what we knew inside our head, but it also had to do with the quality of our and strength of our relationship with all these other sources of knowledge. And so the quality of our knowledge base included the quality of the connections to these other elements. And by drawing that visual diagram and then starting to define what we meant by the knowledge base and what we do with it, and then describing the requirements for that knowledge base to be effective, this visualization of our current state and future state became a very important way to begin the conversation that ended up becoming our strategic plan to transform for the future. So then we expanded that and went to the next level of detail and put working groups to say, for each one of those stakeholders, what was the next level of detail? What kinds of categories of knowledge might they have? And so we used that diagram not only to understand what was going on, but to use that as the basis for the next step of developing a deeper understanding of our total knowledge base. And so you can see the visual brainstorm, the visual mind mapping now is supporting the development of our requirements and of our strategic plans. And then that understanding allowed us to have a conversation about what we saw as the kind of education we were trying to create, what kind of educational environment. And we had to have this discussion that did we see ourselves as an agricultural environment in which we had individual workers that had prototypical agents like Geppetto, the wood carver, puppet maker, and the role that knowledge would have in that kind of an environment, and where knowledge was located. So we use that really this table to help us further develop the environment that would be consistent with an agricultural view of the world. We saw that, yeah, back in the Middle Ages in agricultural societies, that these were the features and the characteristics of their education. And when we went to an industrial age, that knowledge and the way it was organized necessarily changed with it to respond to that environment. So as we were now entering the information age, we were trying to see what kind of a transition would we have to make from the industrial age to the information age in order to respond to this new environment that we were experiencing. You know, the last time our college had made that kind of change was in the late 1800s, when we went from the U.S. as a primarily farm-based organization to the industrial age, and the needs of the profession and the needs of the college and the way it was organized basically changed. And so as we looked in the 2000s towards an industrial information, or from the industrial to becoming an information-based society, we realized that we were going to have to transform the college as well. And so we use this evolving storyboard to help us visualize the nature of that change and to try to help us get in front of those transformational changes. So in this case study then, what I've tried to make the argument for was how the artful use of visual displays allowed us to model and communicate our understanding of this complex environment and helped us come up with a transformation plan to change our department. I want to shift to the second case study, which says one of the things that you get from visualization and narrative and storytelling is useful simplifications of a very complex world, that when you highlight certain elements of the story, it comes at the expense of all the other trivial details which are true, but which might get in the way of helping us understand the most important elements of it. So when we are conducting a campaign plan that might look at a region of the world, let's call it Georgia, Turkey, and Armenia, where we might have to conduct some military operations, if you were just to look at the map and all the details on it and all the populations and look at all the stakeholders, the amount of complexity in there would make you just depressed about ever trying to be able to understand it. So one of the things we can do to simplify it is to organize it into compartments using visual techniques. Like in this case, we've drawn 3 operational areas in the forms of these 3 red boxes and described the nature of the operations going on inside each box, so that we could figure out what had to be done so we could get the right kinds of units in there. And so this act of simplification of organizing this complex region into 3 boxes where certain stereotypical behavior would occur allowed us to begin to develop plans, and we call those logical regions. To the west were those areas near the seaports where we would be receiving supplies and preparing them for onward movement into the theater. These long lines of communication in the middle where we were just trying to move iron mountains that arrived at a seaport over to the operational area where we were conducting security operations. And then the operations in the local region was where that actual security against an opposing force might occur. So this act of visualization and simplification allowed us to understand the scenario enough that we could begin to make good strategy by addressing with this simplified view of the world. And without that kind of visual modeling and systematic understanding, we would not have been able to come up with a plan that fit. So the next thing that we would do is then take that complex geography and render it into almost like an operational diagram, where we could drill deeper into a conceptual understanding of what was going on and look at different regions and tasks and requirements inside each area, looking at things like convoy support centers and rest overnight sites and aerial ports of debarkation where airplanes would land to offload, and lines of communication featuring roads connected by convoy support centers or long rail lines that would come to assembly areas where units could prepare to go into the operational area. So by further simplifying and abstracting that complex geography, we could then turn this into a storyboard where we could do some analysis of requirements and get the right units in there, and then communicate our purpose and intent through the use of this kind of visual display of information. And that would lead us to do things like develop a detailed concept of operation where certain kinds of units located in one of those boxes and in those areas would have to provide mission or would have to perform certain kinds of tasks that would support onward movement of units, that might help us establish theater support bases, or would allow us to provide support to end users. And so this visual display enabled us to develop a set of requirements that, as we filled in the blanks, more and more of our operational mission would take form. So the actual visual display ended up creating creative moments for us where we could use critical thinking and innovation to develop a strategic plan. So this is a combination of words on a page and a visual display. This combination of visual and text-based narrative was effective in helping us develop operational strategies. So the third case study was helping us get our arms around stability planning. So from that previous scenario, if we had gone up and conducted security operations and found it to be effective, then the gunfight would be over, but what would be left would be a need to rebuild civil society. And one of the things that an army can do for you is create the security conditions in which stability and reconstruction can actually occur. Well, that's one of the most complicated and uncertain kinds of missions that there can be. So how can we use visual information and narrative inquiry to solve that? So we could take narrative models or critical thinking models like the managing uncertainty model from Harvard Business Review from 1997 that we've already explored, and take a look at a narrative process that leads you from a description of the state of nature to finding an appropriate strategy for that different kind of state of nature, and then how to translate that into the military environment, and then to help us decide what kind of strategic posture that we should have in that scenario, which would lead to a set of effective actions that we might take, which could then be blended into a portfolio of blended actions that could be managed in much the same way that you manage a investment portfolio, and that would account for things like risk and reward, costs, and would allow us to be able to respond to VUCA, to respond to volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So this is a narrative strategy. Laying it out in a visual way like this in a process helps us understand exactly what's going on. Well, the next simplifying model that we built was to look at a negotiation around what we considered to be a virtual table and populated it with different actors and agents, some of whom had a seat at the table because they were powerful and could veto things. So they were primary stakeholders, and in the same room, in this gray box, bounded by these external walls, these guys in yellow might be people who were big enough stakeholders to get into the room, but who weren't significant enough to get to sit at the table, but they might be consulted. And then this solid line represented sort of a boundary in which we would keep these neutral people who weren't stakeholders or these agents trying to disrupt things. We might keep them out by the use of this barrier. And so this simplified model of stakeholder analysis allowed us to consider who needed to be in the room and at the table, or just in the room, or what the boundaries would be and how we could keep the bad guys out, and how we might keep them inside a contained area where we might be able to control their behavior, but we also realize there'd be people like the press or other nations of the world watching us that would have a response to the kind of negotiations we were doing. So this physical array allowed us to gain insights into what it would mean to conduct effective stakeholder analysis and stakeholder negotiation. And from that, we could then ask a series of questions, say, what is it about these stakeholders in the room that we needed to know in order to make this negotiation around the table more effective? And so we used that visual display to help us generate what we thought were required information elements for our stakeholders, and we could then conduct research to develop a profile of these stakeholders and use that as part of crafting our strategy. So I want you to see that the combination, again, of narrative storytelling and visual planning and visual display allowed us to move from a complex, difficult to understand environment to one where we could begin to develop strategies that made sense. So the powerful forces of visual and narrative inquiry were certainly helpful in this area. Now, from that kind of negotiation or the development of that plan, we might then populate a project management model that looked something like this, that if we were trying to have success in these different lines of operations, like in order to bring peace to the valley and bring stability, you have to take care of security, you have to get good governance, you have to rebuild an economy, you have to have civil control and protection in the form of police and courts and fire, and you might have to have essential services like firemen and trash collection and so forth. So in each of those project areas, or what we might call lines of operations, you might have sets of projects, and those projects might be short-term, mid-term, or long-term based on the number of months. And then you might use the insights that come out of the opportunities that come out of that negotiation room and start building out a campaign plan that takes a look at prioritized tasks in these different time frames. So in this case, having a good structure to fill in provided insights into our understanding of what kind of projects and project management system we needed to have. And so the visual display not only is a nice way to record information, but it actually gives insights into the nature of the problem and might help us solve things because of the way we've structured the search for answers. What came out of that that effort, that group effort, that collaborative effort on stability planning finally was this artifact, that as we began talking about what kinds of projects should we favor, and we realized how complex that, in general, all the best things to do turned out to have these kinds of qualities. And so we use this visual display, this artifact, to help educate our younger planners into the kinds of opportunities that they should be on the lookout for, or the kinds of things that they ought to be trying to develop. Things that are always good to do in a complex world, even if you can't prove it mathematically. It turns out that the qualities that all of these very effective solutions share are that they are fundamental, that they're dealing with basic human needs at the root cause level. So they're fundamental to the human experience. They tend to be must-do things that have a certain urgency and a seriousness about them, and that there is a relatively low cost to potential reward. So it's an asymmetric payoff, we would call that, where for an investment of a little bit, that if it pays off, the return is extraordinary. So we look for those kinds of qualities and use that to compare between different choices. And it might also be something that is not only relatively low cost, but absolutely low cost as a percentage of your total capital, so that you're not investing most of your available capital into a single solution and hope that it works. That the more things that you can try at lower real costs gives you more flexibility to develop other opportunities later on. So combining all of those qualities, we might think of it as a desire to develop favorable asymmetric payoffs, that if we would want to have a portfolio results distribution that looked like this graphic, in which the average project on was net positive. They gave a positive return on investment, and that we could very carefully define the risk. So we weren't taking these huge losses, but that we had the possibility for huge wins. So we had the fat tail extended in our favor, but a tightly constrained left-hand side of the curve where we could very carefully control and minimize our risks, but we still retain the possibility for large favorable gains. The other things that we looked for turned out to be things that could scale over time, that if we had a little bit of success with the prototype, that it could then be scaled across the nation and used in many different villages. So we looked at that as a quality to evaluate potential choices. If this is successful, can we scale this much larger? And we would favor those things that were scalable. And businesses do the same thing. And projects that had rapid cycle time, so we could quickly find out whether or not this thing was going to work or not. And then could we find projects that were robust with respect to VUCA? In other words, that they could still be successful in spite of an environment that had a lot of volatility or uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. We were looking for things that were robust and could respond to environmental changes and still be viable and effective. So this visual display turned out to be a very powerful way to turn those words on the left-hand side into a easily understood and discussable icon or artifact that allowed us to rapidly educate and then have good professional discussions with our planners that were actually trying to find these kinds of projects. So what I've tried to do with all three of these case studies then is show that there is a real synergy that is possible between visual planning and visual strategy making and narrative strategy and opportunity making. So when we can use both of those qualities in design thinking or in our planning, then we've improved the possibilities for developing good, robust, satisfying strategies. And so those are skills that we should be able to develop as OD practitioners or as strategic planners so that we can use the full array of tools that are out there when it comes to developing strategies. So if you find yourself really comfortable with one but not the other, you might look at this course as an opportunity to start practicing some of the things that need further development. Or you might look at this course as an opportunity to get even better at things that are already strong so that you can exploit it more fully. So consider, as you look at your own educational needs, how you might choose to do certain projects or assignments, or the way that you solve problems might take into account your assessment of where you are in both the verbal and the visual planning tools. So you could come up with a pathway for your own best personal and professional development. Okay, so I want to open this up to questions for you now. That was the the overview of the three case studies I wanted to share with you.